Chapter 13. Reliability and Validity of Race Differences in Intelligence. 1. Summary of race differences in intelligence. 2. Reliability of racial IQ data. 3. Validity of racial IQ's number concepts. 4. Validity of racial IQ's educational attainment. 5. Validity of racial IQ's per capita income and economic growth. Evidence on the intelligence of the races has been presented in detail in the preceding chapters. In this chapter, we give an integrated summary of these differences. We then consider the reliability and validity of these IQs. 1. Summary of race differences in intelligence. Table 13.1.1 gives a summary of the evidence on race differences in intelligence that has been set out in detail for the races individually in chapters 3 through 12. The table lists the races ranked in ascending order of their intelligence levels and gives their geographical location, the number of studies, the number of countries in which the studies have been carried out, the median IQ, and the range of iOS. Row 1 gives a median IQ of 54 for the Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, derived from 3 studies in which the IQs range from 48 to 62. Rows 2 and 3 give IQs of 62 and 63 for Aborigines in Australia and New Guinea. Combining these two results gives a weighted IQ of 62. Row 4 gives an IQ of 67 for Africans in Sub-Saharan Africa, derived from 57 studies. Row 5 gives an IQ of 71 for Africans in the Caribbean and Brazil, derived from 14 studies. Row 6 gives an IQ of 85 for Africans in the United States, derived from 29 studies. Row 7 gives the same. IQ of 85 for Africans in the Netherlands, derived from 7 studies. Row 8 gives an almost identical IQ of 86 for Africans in Britain, derived from 18 studies. Thus, Africans outside Africa consistently obtain higher IQs than indigenous Africans. There are 2 explanations for this. First, many Africans in the Caribbean, the United States, the Netherlands, and Britain are racial hybrids with appreciable amounts of white ancestry. Second, Africans outside Africa live to varying degrees in societies run largely by Europeans, who are responsible for providing higher living standards that have a beneficial environmental effect on their IQs, largely by providing better nutrition and health care. Rows 9 through 13 give IQs for South Asians and North Africans in various locations. Row 9 gives an IQ of 84 for indigenous South Asians and North Africans, derived from 37 studies in 17 countries. Row 10 gives an IQ of 92 for South Asians in Britain, obtained from 16 studies. Row 11 gives an IQ of 85 for South Asians in continental Europe, derived from 18 studies in 3 countries. Row 12 gives an IQ of 86 for South Asians in Africa, derived from 6 studies in 2 countries. Row 13 gives an IQ of 85 for South Asians, derived from 3 studies in Fiji, Malaysia, and Mauritius. The IQs of the South Asians and North Africans are fairly consistent, ranging from 84 to 91. Row 14 gives an IQ of 85 for indigenous Pacific Islanders, derived from 14 samples, and Row 15 gives an IQ of 90 derived from 12 studies for Maori Pacific Islanders in New Zealand. The reason for the higher IQ of the Maori Pacific Islanders in New Zealand is likely to be that they enjoy higher living standards by virtue of living in a country run by Europeans. For this reason, the IQ of 85 is adopted as the best reading of the IQ of Pacific Islanders. Row 16 gives an IQ of 87 for indigenous Southeast Asians, derived from 11 samples in 6 counties. Row 17 gives an IQ of 93 for Southeast Asians in the United States and the Netherlands. The reason that this is higher than in Southeast Asia is probably that there has been some selective migration and that living standards are higher. Row 18 gives an IQ of 86 for Native Americans in North America, derived from 19 studies. Row 19 gives the same IQ of 86 for Native Americans in Latin America, derived from 9 studies from 5 countries. The IQ of 86 is adopted as the best reading of the IQ of Native Americans. Row 20 gives an IQ of 91 for Arctic peoples in North America, derived from 15 studies in Alaska and Canada. Row 21 gives an IQ of 99 for Europeans, derived from 66 studies in 25 countries. This median excludes the Balkans, who are a European South. Asian Klein. Row 22 gives an IQ of 99% for Europeans outside Europe derived from 23 studies in 12 counties. The median of the entire set of studies is 99% and is adopted as the best reading of the IQ of Europeans. Row 23 gives an IQ of 105 for indigenous East Asians derived from 60 studies in 7 counties. Row 24 gives an IQ of 101 for East Asians in the United States derived from 26 studies. Row 25 gives an IQ of 102 for East Asians elsewhere derived from 9 studies in 5 countries. The reason for the higher IQ of East Asians in East Asia than in the United States and elsewhere is probably that there has been some selective migration of those below average intelligence. In the case of Belgium, Canada, and the Netherlands, it cannot be due to living standards, because these are as high as those in East Asia. It may be that the lower IQ of 99% of East Asians in Brazil and Malaysia is partly attributable to lower living standards in those countries. Because of the likelihood of some element of selective migration of East Asians to countries outside Northeast Asia, the IC of 105 for indigenous East Asians is adopted as the best reading of the IQ of East Asians. Table 13.1 Summary of race differences in intelligence. 2. Reliability of racial IQ data. The IQs of many of the samples are likely to be to some degree inaccurate because of sampling and measurement errors. The accuracy of the results is known as their reliability and is assessed by examining how far 2 samples obtained for the same country give consistent results. The correlation between 2 IQs obtained for the same countries, taking the 2 extreme values where 3 or more IQs are available, is 0.94. This shows that the IQs are highly reliable. The validity of the IQs is the question of the extent to which they provide genuine or valid measures of the cognitive abilities of samples. It has often been argued that the peoples who obtain low IQs are really just as intelligent as Europeans, but the tests are biased against them. The issue of test bias has been discussed at length by Jensen in his book, Bias in Mental Tests, and is shown to be not a tenable view. Individuals and races that do well on intelligence tests also tend to do well in education, earnings, job performance, and socioeconomic status. An Australian psychologist, Murray Dyke, has given this verdict on the test bias thesis. The evidence indicates that cognitive tests are equally reliable across races, are of equivalent item difficulty across races, yield similar subtest correlations, and factor analyses yield similar results. The question of whether standard ability tests are culturally biased has been answered. They are not. A further recent verdict on test bias comes from Brown, Reynolds, and Whitaker. Research to date consistently finds that standardized cognitive tests are not biased in terms of predictive or construct validity. 3. Validity of racial IO data, number concepts. The validity of racial IQ data means the extent to which they measure real differences in cognitive ability beyond the ability to solve the problems presented in intelligence tests. There are several ways of establishing the validity of the race differences in intelligence. We consider first race differences in the development of the concepts of numbers. It has been shown by Butterworth that sophisticated numerical systems containing numbers for 1 to 10, tens, thousands, tens of thousands, and hundreds of thousands were devised by the South Asian and North African and the East Asians 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and a little later by the Europeans and the Native Americans. The Bushmen, Africans, Australian Aborigines, and New Guinean Aborigines only devised numbers for 1, 2, few, and many. In some of the languages spoken by the Bushmen and the Australian Aborigines, it is possible to express numbers up to 6 or 7 by use of multiples of 1 and 2. Thus 7 is expressed as 2, 2, 2, 1. Larger numbers cannot be expressed because it becomes too difficult to remember the number of 2s and 1s. Construction of complex number systems must have required moderately high intelligence, and the racial differences in these suggest that race differences in intelligence were present several thousand years ago. 4. Validity of racial IQ data, educational attainment. From the early years of the 20th century, the validity of intelligence tests has been examined by investigating the extent to which they are correlated with educational attainment. Numerous studies have found that IQs and educational achievement are correlated at around 0.6 to 0.7%. This shows that intelligence tests are valid measures of general cognitive ability and not merely the ability to solve the problems presented in the tests. The same procedure is adopted here to examine the validity of race differences in IQs. The problem is to determine whether race differences in IQs are associated with differences in educational attainment. The procedure is to use nations as the units of analysis, calculate IQs for nations, categorize nations by race, and assess how far the IQs of nations are related to national scores on mathematics and science. IQs for nations have been obtained from the data presented in the preceding chapters. Where 2 or more IQs are given for a nation, the median has been taken. The IQ for Latvia has been taken from Lin and Van Hanen. For multiracial societies, IQs have been calculated by weighting the IQs of the races by their proportions in the population. The IQ for Chile has been calculated from the normative study of 4,213 5 to 16-year-olds tested with the progressive matrices by Marinkovic, Sparosvich, Santana, Game, Gomez, and Marinkovic. National scores on mathematics and science have been obtained from the International Studies of Achievement in Mathematics and Science. These are a series of studies carried out between the mid-1960s and 1994, in which representative samples of primary and secondary school students from a number of countries have been given tests of mathematics and science. Some results are available for a total of 52 countries, but not all countries participated in all the studies, so there are quite a lot of missing data. 5 data sets of national scores on mathematics and science have been used here and are given in Table 13.2. Column 1 gives the nations categorized by race. Column 2 gives the nations' IQs. Column 3 gives the data from the first 2 international studies of achievement in mathematics and science scores carried out between the mid-1960s and 1986, and combined by Hanushek and Kimco to give a single score for each nation set on a mean of 50 and standard deviation of 10. Columns 4, 5, 6, and 7 give, respectively, results for 10 and 14-year-olds in mathematics and science in the 3rd International Mathematics and Science Study, carried out in 1994. The data for these are given by Beaton, Mullis, Martin, Gonzalez, Kelly, and Smith, and Beaton, Martin, Mullis, Gonzalez, Smith, and Kelly. The nations are categorized by the racial compositions of their populations. The first row for each race gives its median IQ and its median. Table 13.2. National IQs and attainments in math and science. Educational attainment. Shown first are the 6 East Asian counties. These obtain the highest IQ and have the highest scores in all 5 measures of achievement in mathematics and science. Shown next are the 30 European countries. These include the nations outside Europe, but populated largely by European peoples, including Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. These have the 2nd highest IQ and the 2nd highest scores in mathematics and science. Shown third are the 3 multiracial countries of South America. They have a median IQ of 86. Data for their scores in mathematics and science are well below those of the European nations. Shown fourth are the 9 countries of South and Southeast Asia. Their IQ of 86 is the same as that of the South American countries. Their scores in mathematics and science are slightly higher than in the South American countries, but the results for these are very limited. The scores of the South and Southeast Asian countries in mathematics and science are much below those of the European nations. Shown fifth are the 4 countries of sub-Saharan Africa. They have the lowest IQ and the lowest scores in mathematics and science. The bottom row gives the correlations between national IQs and the scores on educational attainment. The correlations range between 0.81 and 0.89 and are all statistically significant at the 1% level. These correlations are reduced from their true values by measurement error. In fact, the average of the intercorrelations between the 5 measures of educational attainment is 0.78 and is lower than the average of the correlations between the IQs and the 5 measures of educational attainment. Correction for the unreliability of these measures gives a true correlation of 1 between national IQs and national educational attainment. This validates the national IQs and shows that they measure important cognitive abilities and not simply the ability to do intelligence tests. To provide an estimate of the magnitude of the race differences in mathematics and science, as compared with the differences in intelligence, the race differences in IQs and in mathematics and science given in column 3 can be expressed in standard deviation units. These comparisons are given in table 13.3. The IQs and scores in mathematics and science of Europeans are used as the standard against which the D scores of the other races are compared. It will be seen that for all comparisons, the race differences in educational attainment are greater than the differences in intelligence. Thus, the East Asians have a 0.3% 3DZ advantage over the Europeans in intelligence, but a greater advantage of 0.4% in educational attainment. This could be because their schools are more efficient, as I have argued in the case of Japan. For instance, the school year in Japan is 240 days as compared with 180 days in Britain and the United States, and 155 days in France. Schools in East Asia are typically more orderly and have fewer discipline problems than those in European countries, so East Asian school students are able to learn more. It may be that East Asian school students have a stronger work ethic than Europeans, and that this contributes to their better educational attainment. The other 3 racial and ethnic groups do worse in educational attainment than in intelligence. Thus, the South Americans are lower than the Europeans by 0.6% 6D on intelligence, but by 2.2% 7D on educational attainment. The South Asians are lower than the Europeans by 0.9% 3% on intelligence, but by 1.3% 0D on educational attainment. And the Africans are lower than the Europeans by 2% on intelligence, but by 2.4% 4D on educational attainment. Evidently, there are other factors over and above lower intelligence that are depressing educational attainment in these economically developing countries. Possibly schools are less efficient, or there is a weaker work ethic. The reasons for these race differences in educational attainment have been very poorly researched by educationists, who do not even acknowledge that differences in intelligence are a major factor, although clearly there are other factors operating. Table 13.3. Comparison of national IQs and educational attainments in math and science. 5. Validity of racial IQ data, per capita income and economic growth. A further method for establishing the validity of intelligence tests is to examine their relation to per capita income and economic growth. Several studies of individuals have shown that IQs measured in childhood are correlated with earnings in adulthood at about 0.35 to 0.37. Because intelligence is measured in childhood, it is generally considered that IQ is a determinant of earnings in adulthood. This is supported by numerous studies showing that intelligence is positively related to job proficiency at a magnitude of around 0.4 to 0.6. The validity of race differences in IQs has been examined by extending this law to races. In Lin and Van Hanen, we have estimated IQs for all the 185 nations in the world with populations over 50,000. These national IQs are determined by the racial composition of the populations, as shown in the last section. We found that the national IQs are correlated at 0.6% with real GDP per capita in 1998 and at 0.63 with GNP per capita in 1998. This shows that national IQs explain 38% and 32% respectively of the variance in per capita GDP and GNP. National IQs therefore make a significant contribution to national income as defined by these two measures. The correlations are not huge because national per capita incomes are significantly determined by other factors, of which the most important are the possession of natural resources and the presence of a market economy. Thus, for instance, the real GDP per capita in 1998 in Qatar was $20,987, about the same as that in Britain, and much higher than that in countries in South Asia with about the same IQ but no natural resources, such as India and Jordan. The reason for the high GDP in Qatar lies in the possession of oil, which is not possessed by India or Jordan. The second major factor determining national incomes is the presence of a market economy. Thus, the countries of Eastern Europe have about the same IQs as those of Western Europe, but they have much lower per capita incomes as compared with Britain and France. Similarly, the per capita income in China is much lower than in Hong Kong and Singapore, although the people are all or mainly Chinese and have closely similar IQs. The reason for this is that economic development in China has been retarded by the communist economy, while that in Hong Kong and Singapore has been facilitated by market economies. In the countries taken together, the extent to which they have market economies measured by the Index of Economic Freedom is correlated at 0.7%, with real GDP per capita slightly higher than the correlation of IQ with real GDP per capita in 1998, showing both economic freedom and IQs contribute substantially to national wealth. Economic freedom was correlated at 0.6%, with real GNP per capita in 1998, as compared to the correlation of 0.6% between national IQs and GNP per capita. There are also significant associations between national IQs and the rate of economic growth during the 20th century. Thus, the correlation of national IQ and growth of GDP from 1950 to 1990 is 0.5%. This shows that the countries with higher IQs are becoming more affluent, and the gap between rich high IQ countries and poor low IQ countries is increasing. This is as would be expected because economic growth is driven by new high-technology products such as computers, mobile phones, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, weapons, automobiles, and forth, which can only be designed by peoples with high IQs. Nations with low IQs earn their living principally by the export of agricultural products, raw materials, and minerals, for which there is less demand and prices are lower, so their economic growth rates and per capita incomes remain low. These substantial correlations between national IQs and per capita incomes and rates of economic growth provide further validation for the measures of national intelligence, because they can be predicted and the prediction is verified. However, a caveat is required. The positive association between individual IQs and earnings within countries is a one-way causal relationship. IQs that are measured in childhood and adolescence are a determinant of the earnings of adults, while the earnings of adults are not a determinant of their intelligence. The positive association between national IQs and national per capita incomes is not so straightforward. It is a two-way causal interaction involving positive feedback. National populations with high IQs are able to produce sophisticated goods and services that command high prices in international markets. This generates high per capita national income, which enables these populations to provide favorable environments with high-quality nutrition, healthcare, and education for the development of the intelligence of their children. When these children become adults, they are able to use their high intelligence to produce more sophisticated goods and services that command high prices in international markets, and so on in a benign circle.